shut the doors.
The order came sharp, final. Security moved instantly. Inside the glass-walled boardroom, stock prices collapsed in real time, wiping out years of power in seconds. Suits worth more than most homes sat rigid in their chairs, pretending control while panic leaked through clenched jaws. One director stood abruptly. "Tell me this isn't real, but we're getting ahead of ourselves." Because what happened in that Kansas City boardroom wasn't random. It was the climax of a plan so carefully orchestrated, so patiently executed, that when the trap finally sprang shut, even the man who built a $40 billion empire never saw it coming. This is the story of Martin Harper, self-made, brilliant, untouchable, or so he thought. 15 years earlier, Martin had started Axiom Industries in a Kansas garage with nothing but ambition and a laptop that barely worked. White kid from a farm town where Sunday meant church and Monday meant proving you were tougher than everyone else. His father ran a hardware store. His mother taught elementary school. Martin learned early that if you wanted respect, you took it. You out-hustled, out-charmed, out-maneuvered everyone in your path. By the time Axiom went public, Martin Harper wasn't just a CEO. He was a brand, magazine covers, conference keynotes, the kind of man other men wanted to be. And like most men who build empires, Martin made one critical mistake. He started believing his own legend. By the time we reach our story, Martin's riding high. 40 billion in valuation, offices in 12 countries, a corner suite overlooking Kansas City with floor-to-ceiling windows that made him feel like a king surveying his kingdom. But cracks were forming. The board of directors, once his loyal admirers, had started whispering. Martin's decisions were getting reckless, impulsive, billion-dollar gambles based on gut feeling rather than data. Some paid off spectacularly. Others burned money like kindling. The venture capitalists and independent directors were getting nervous. They needed someone to balance Martin's chaos with order. Enter Elena Covington, Harvard MBA, Goldman Sachs veteran, a black woman who'd fought twice as hard for half the recognition in rooms full of men who looked like Martin. Elena grew up in Kansas City's West End, where her grandmother's soul food dinners taught her about community and her Sunday services taught her about patience. She'd learned to read people, to wait for the right moment, to never underestimate the power of being underestimated. When Axiom's board courted her for chief financial officer, they saw exactly what they needed, someone analytical where Martin was impulsive, diplomatic where he was blunt, steady where he was volatile. Martin welcomed her. On paper, Elena was perfect. Someone to handle the boring numbers while he chased his bold visions. But working late nights on quarterly reports and investor calls, something unexpected happened. Chemistry. Elena's sharp wit made Martin laugh. Martin's charisma and passion drew Elena in, over bourbon in his office, overlooking the Kansas City skyline. Vulnerability turned to confession. Two ambitious people from vastly different worlds, trading stories, finding connection. And then, one night, a kiss. The affair burned hot and fast. For a few months, the CEO and CFO were lovers behind closed doors. Martin relished having Elena by his side in every way. Elena, against her better judgment, let herself imagine Martin could truly see her as an equal. But ego has a way of poisoning everything it touches. Martin pulled back, afraid of whispers, unsettled by how much he trusted her. Elena, sensing his retreat, ended it one night with tears she refused to let him see. They agreed to stay professional. But something fundamental had shifted. Elena's eyes were now wide open. 3 years passed. On the surface, nothing changed. They worked together cordially. Martin's volatile leadership continued. The board grew more concerned. And Elena, quietly, methodically, built relationships with every director, every major shareholder, every executive who chafed under Martin's erratic rule. She became the voice of reason, the steady hand, the favorite. Martin never noticed the ground shifting beneath him. Then came the night that would change everything. 18 months before our boardroom drama, Elena sat alone in her office, preparing for a routine financial audit. old acquisition records. A small software firm, Axiom, had aggressively taken over 7 years ago. The numbers felt wrong, like a puzzle piece forced into place. Elena dug deeper, traced a payment from Axiom to an unknown shell company. From that shell company to a private account. Her breath caught. A kickback scheme. Classic. Illegal. Prosecutable. And it had Martin Harper's fingerprints all over it. Elena sat frozen under the glow of her desk lamp, heart hammering. This was the man she'd been close to. The man she'd trusted with more than business secrets. And here lay evidence of serious wrongdoing. Part of her wanted to confront him immediately, but Elena's training, her instincts, her grandmother's voice in her head whispered, "Patience." She quietly made copies, secured them off-site, and that night, lying awake staring at her ceiling, Elena made a choice. If it came down to protecting Martin, or protecting the company, she knew which one she'd choose. From that moment, Elena Covington was no longer just the CFO. She was a woman with a loaded gun, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. Martin Harper, blind with arrogance, never suspected that the person he'd underestimated most would become the architect of his destruction. The trap was set. Now it just needed the right bait. So here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. When someone you once loved holds the evidence that could destroy you, what stops them from using it? The morning Martin Harper's world ended started like any other Monday. Coffee at 6 a.m., gym by 6:30. Suit pressed so sharp it could cut glass. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie, practicing the speech he'd give the board. Confident, commanding, the kind of presence that made grown men with billions in assets nod and fall in line. He had no idea that 18 floors below, in the lobby of Axiom's headquarters, Elena Covington was arriving early too. But she wasn't practicing a speech. She was checking her phone for the 3rd time in as many minutes, waiting for a confirmation message from a number she'd memorized but never saved. The message came at 6:47 a.m. 3 words, filing confirmed. 9:30. Elena slipped the phone back into her purse and walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against marble with the rhythm of a ticking clock. She'd been planning this moment for 18 months. Every conversation with board members, every carefully placed document, every alliance built in conference rooms and over lunches Martin never attended because he was too important for small talk. The architect doesn't rush. The architect waits until the foundation is perfect, and then she brings down the house. But here's what you need to understand about revenge served cold. It requires a kind of discipline most people don't possess. Because for 18 months, Elena had to sit across from Martin in meetings, smile when he made jokes, nod when he dismissed her concerns, and never once let him see the knife she was sharpening behind her back. How many of us could do that? How many of us could look someone we once kissed in the eye and know that we're about to destroy them? The emergency board meeting was called for 8 a.m. Unusual. Urgent. Martin had sent the summons Sunday night, right after he'd leaked to a journalist that Axiom was pursuing an $8 billion acquisition. The board hadn't approved it. Hell, the board hadn't even heard the full details. But Martin Harper didn't ask permission. He never had. And that arrogance, that absolute certainty that he could bend reality to his will, was about to become his executioner. By 7:45, the 15th floor boardroom was filling up. Directors arrived with that particular tension people carry when they know something's wrong, but can't quite name it. Patrice Dubois, one of the independent directors and one of the few other women in the room, caught Elena's eye as she entered. A small nod passed between them. Nothing suspicious, just acknowledgement. But in that nod was 18 months of lunches where Elena had listened, really listened, to Patrice's concerns about Martin's leadership. 18 months of being the reasonable voice, the safe harbor, the alternative. Philip Cheng sat across the table, scrolling through his tablet with the frown of a man reviewing numbers that didn't make sense. Ahmed Hassan, another director, whispered something to the person beside him. The room hummed with that pre-storm electricity, the kind you feel in your teeth before lightning strikes. And then Martin walked in. He commanded space the way some men command armies. 6'2", silver at the temples, that smile that had charmed investors out of hundreds of millions. He set his leather portfolio on the table with a thud that said, "I'm in charge here." Eyes swept the room, cataloguing who looked loyal, who looked skeptical, who needed to be won over or crushed. His gaze landed on Elena for just a second. She gave him the same professional smile she'd given him for 3 years. He saw nothing behind it. That was his first mistake of the day. Actually, that's not true. His first mistake was made 7 years ago, when he authorized payments to a shell company to grease a hostile takeover. His second mistake was not destroying every shred of evidence. His third mistake was hiring a CFO smart enough to find it. But who's counting? Martin cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," he began. And even in those words you could hear it, the assumption that they'd come because he'd summoned them, not because they had a fiduciary duty. I'll get right to it. Axiom cannot afford to miss the AI revolution. We need to make bold moves, and that's why I've decided we must acquire Zephyr Analytics immediately. Decided, not proposed, not suggested. Decided. Philip Cheng's frown deepened. "Martin, an $8 billion acquisition is a significant pivot. We haven't done our due diligence on Zephyr. The board only got the summary financials this morning." "Zephyr's founder is ready to deal now," Martin shot back, that edge creeping into his voice. "If we wait, a competitor will snap them up. I've been in this industry long enough to know when to seize an opportunity." And there it was. The unspoken message, "I know better than you. I always have." Elena watched from her seat 2 positions down, legal pad open, pen poised. To anyone observing, she was the diligent CFO, taking notes, ready to discuss financial implications. But underneath the table, her foot tapped against the floor. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. A metronome counting down to detonation. Have you ever been in a room where everyone's having one conversation, but there's a completely different conversation happening underneath? Where words mean something else entirely. That boardroom was thick with subtext. Martin thought he was rallying his troops. The board thought they were pushing back against an impulsive CEO. And Elena? Elena was watching a man walk himself to the gallows while whistling a happy tune. "We have concerns about cash flow," Patrice said carefully. "Integration risks. The market's already volatile and—" "The market rewards boldness," Martin interrupted. He was pacing now, that restless energy that made him magnetic on stage and insufferable in meetings. "You want to be on the wrong side of history here, because that's what hesitation gets you." Ahmed Hassan shifted in his seat. "Martin, I think what we're asking for is time to properly evaluate." "We don't have time." Martin's voice rose, and several directors flinched. This was the problem. Right here. The volatility. The inability to be questioned. For 15 years, Martin's instincts had been right more often than wrong, and that success had calcified into something dangerous. He'd stopped seeing the board as partners and started seeing them as obstacles. Elena glanced at her phone. 9:15 a.m. 15 minutes. Her heart was hammering now, though you'd never know it from her face. She'd practiced this part too, the calm before the storm. Because when chaos erupts, people look for the steady person in the room. They look for the one who isn't panicking. Elena had learned that in boardrooms full of white men who assumed she'd be emotional, irrational, easy to dismiss, she'd learned to be stone. And today, being stone would make her look like the only rational choice for leadership. But here's the thing about being stone, you still feel everything underneath. And what Elena felt in that moment was a sickening cocktail of righteousness and grief. Because once upon a time, in this very building, Martin had told her about growing up on a Kansas farm, about being the smart kid in a small town who knew he was destined for something bigger. He'd been vulnerable, real, and she'd cared about him, maybe even loved him in that brief, intense way you love someone when you're both ambitious and lonely, and you've found someone who understands the weight of wanting more. That man was about to be destroyed by the woman he'd made love to. Is that justice? Is that cruelty? Or is it just what happens when you break trust with someone who has the tools to dismantle you? "Look," Martin said, planting both hands on the table and leaning forward. I called this meeting to get your buy-in out of respect, but Axiom is my company. I founded it, I built it, and I'm telling you this acquisition is not optional. It's happening. His eyes swept the room, challenging anyone to contradict him. Now, we can do this the easy way, or... Zit. A phone vibrated against wood, loud, insistent. Ahmed glanced down at his device, frowning. Then another buzz. Patrice's phone, then another. Around the table, phones lit up like Christmas trees, notifications cascading in a wave of digital urgency. Elena finally let herself look at her own screen, though she already knew what she'd find. The notification glowed, breaking news alert. Philip Cheng was staring at his tablet, face draining of color. What on earth? He muttered. Everyone, please, can we focus? Martin's voice had that sharp edge now, the one that came out when he felt control slipping. Whatever it is can wait. But it couldn't wait, and the proof was right there on the wall behind him, where a stock ticker displayed Axiom's real-time share price. That number, which had opened at $140 that morning, steady and strong, was now falling. Fast. $135. $130. $127. Someone gasped. Martin whirled around to look at the screen, and in that moment, in the split second before he understood what was happening, Elena saw his face. Confusion. Irritation. And then, as the number dropped further, something else. The first whisper of fear. $122. $118. $115. What is happening? Martin demanded, but his voice cracked on the last word. He fumbled for his phone, hands that had signed billion-dollar deals now shaking slightly as he pulled up the news. Around the table, directors were doing the same, scrolling frantically, reading words that couldn't possibly be true. And then Martin found it, the headline that would end his career, the words that would turn him from untouchable CEO to cautionary tale. Breaking. SEC opens investigation into Axiom Industries merger irregularities. Whistleblower alleges kickback scheme. For a moment, one perfect crystalline moment, the room was utterly silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to stop. Martin stood frozen, phone in hand, reading and rereading those words as if he could change them through sheer force of will. His face went from confusion to comprehension to horror in the space of 3 heartbeats. This can't be real. This can't be happening. Not now. Not here. Not. His eyes snapped to Elena. And Elena, for the first time that morning, didn't hide what she was feeling. She met his gaze with steady, unflinching certainty. In that look was everything. Yes, it was me. Yes, I did this. Yes, you forced my hand. It says... Ahmed's voice was barely a whisper. It says a senior Axiom executive provided evidence that Martin Harper used a shell company to funnel payments during an acquisition in 2018. 2018. The Zephyr takeover. The deal Martin thought was buried so deep it would never surface. Except Elena had found it. Elena had documented it. And Elena had just handed it to the Securities and Exchange Commission with a bow on top. Around the table, you could see the realization spreading like a virus. Patrice had a hand over her mouth. Philip looked like he might be sick. Clarence Shaw, the board chairman, had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that comes before violence or tears. The stock ticker kept falling. $110. $105. $98. Billions of dollars evaporating in real time. Not just Martin's billions. Everyone's billions. Every shareholder, every employee with stock options, every pension fund that had bet on Axiom's future. All of it draining away like water through a sieve. And Martin? Martin was having what you might call a significant emotional event. His breathing went shallow. His face flushed red, then pale, then red again. The phone trembled in his grip, because in that moment he understood everything. 18 months of Elena's calm professionalism, the way she'd cultivated relationships with board members, The late nights she'd spent reviewing old acquisition files. It had all been leading here. To this room, this moment, this public execution. She'd played him. Perfectly. And he'd never seen it coming. Have you ever watched someone realize they've lost? Not just a game or an argument, but lost in a way that can't be undone. It's a terrible thing to witness. The human mind tries to reject it, searches desperately for an escape route, a way to rewind time. You can see Martin's brain doing that now, cycling through denial and rage and bargaining, all in the span of seconds. And then the panic set in. Shut the doors! Martin lunged toward the boardroom entrance, voice raw with desperation. Nobody leaves this room. 2 executive assistants hovering outside jumped back, startled. Martin grabbed the heavy glass doors himself, yanking them closed with a bang that echoed like a gunshot. His fingers fumbled with the lock. Click, the sound of a cage closing. Directors stared at their CEO in shock. This wasn't normal. This wasn't professional. This was a man having a complete meltdown in real time, and they were locked in a room with him. Clarence Shaw stood slowly, both hands raised in a calming gesture. Martin, what are you doing? No one is leaving until we get this sorted out, Martin snarled, whirling to face the room. A lock of his perfectly styled hair had fallen across his forehead. Sweat beaded at his temples. The magazine cover CEO had transformed into something cornered and dangerous. This garbage accusation is going to tank the company. It's a lie. I need all of you to stick together and deny it. Martin, Philip started. We'll call a press conference. Martin talked over him, pacing now like a caged animal. We'll say it's a short seller attack, fake news. We'll freeze trading if we can. Elena, he spun toward his CFO, and there was something desperate in his eyes now, almost pleading. We need financial controls in place. Do something. You're the CFO, so do something. Elena rose from her chair with deliberate slowness. She smoothed her charcoal blazer, buying herself a moment to let the room settle into the reality of what was happening. When she spoke, her voice cut through Martin's panic like a knife through fog. Martin, we cannot deny what is true. 7 words. That's all it took. The documents are already with the SEC, Elena continued, and her calm was absolute. The eye of the hurricane. They'll have subpoenas on the way within hours. Denying it will only make things worse. You. Martin's voice was strangled. How did you? And then the understanding hit him full force, and it was like watching a building collapse. It was you. You're the whistleblower. Gasps around the table. Directors looked between Martin and Elena, trying to piece together what this meant. Was the CFO involved in the scandal? Was she turning on her boss? What exactly was happening here? Elena stood very still, and when she answered, she addressed not just Martin, but the entire board. I discovered evidence 18 months ago that Axiom's 2018 acquisition involved illegal kickback payments. I tried to handle it quietly. You liar! The word exploded from Martin like a gunshot. You never brought anything to me. Never. His fist slammed down on the mahogany table, and several directors flinched. This is a coup. She's trying to take me down. He turned to the board, appealing to them with everything he had left. I brought Elena on board. I trusted her. I gave her access to everything. And this is how she repays me? With false allegations to the SEC to grab power. False allegations. Elena felt something hot flash through her chest at those words. After everything, after the evidence she'd compiled, after the sleepless nights wrestling with her conscience, after choosing principle over every easier path, he was calling her a liar. To her face. In front of the board. Her voice, when it came, was cold. Martin, you know nothing I've said is false. The hell I don't. The shell company was registered in Delaware under the name Axion Holdings, similar enough to Axiom to seem legitimate, different enough to escape casual notice. You funneled $302 million through it to key stakeholders in the target company. In exchange, they dropped their resistance to the hostile takeover and recommended their shareholders accept your offer. The specificity of it hung in the air. Martin's face went slack. Because those weren't the details of a made-up story. Those were the details of what actually happened, and she'd just recited them from memory like she'd spent months memorizing every transaction, every date, every dollar. Which, of course, she had. The evidence is all in that article, Elena continued. And more will come out. The truth is, you crossed legal and ethical lines, and you hid it from the board. I did what I had to do to protect this company and its shareholders. Patrice Dubois was the first to find her voice. Elena, are you saying you blew the whistle on our own CEO? Elena turned to face Patrice directly. I am. I did. The words settled over the room like snow, muffling everything, making it hard to breathe. Because this wasn't just a corporate scandal anymore. This was betrayal. This was warfare. This was a woman who'd been inside Martin's inner circle, who'd had access to his secrets, who'd once shared his bed, and she'd used all of it to destroy him. Is that heroic? Is that ruthless? Or is it just what happens when someone with integrity runs headlong into someone without it? Martin staggered back a step, hand gripping the back of his chair for support. His world was tilting, sliding sideways, and he couldn't find purchase. Around the table, he saw directors looking at him not with sympathy but with suspicion, with anger. Because if Elena Covington, steady, reliable Elena who'd navigated them through 2 quarters of market volatility, if she had gone to the SEC, then she must have had serious cause. They trusted her more than they trusted him. When did that happen? When did the loyalty shift? Martin's mind raced through the last 3 years, trying to pinpoint the moment he lost control. But there was no single moment. It had been erosion, slow, invisible. While he'd been focused on his grand visions and bold moves, Elena had been building relationships, earning trust, positioning herself as the reasonable alternative. She'd been patient, strategic, everything he wasn't. She'd beaten him at a game he didn't even know he was playing. The stock ticker on the wall, $92, $89, $85. Clarence Shaw stood, face grave. Martin, if what Elena is saying is true, then this is extremely serious. We will need to suspend any acquisition talks and address this investigation immediately. He looked around at the other directors. I think we have no choice but to pause Martin's authority as CEO until we understand what's going on. Pause his authority. The words were corporate speak for what they really meant. You're done. You can't do this. Martin's voice came out strangled, desperate. I am Axiom. Without me, none of you would be here. The stock, he gestured wildly at the plunging numbers. The stock is tanking because of her, because she leaked this. This is sabotage. He pointed at Elena, hand shaking. She's destroying this company just to take power. Elena had been waiting for this. The personal attack. The desperate attempt to make this about ambition rather than ethics. She'd known it was coming, had prepared for it, but it still stung in a way she hadn't expected. Because there was a version of this story where she was the villain, the scorned lover who weaponized her position for revenge. And Martin was trying to tell that version right now. But she had the truth on her side. And more importantly, she had the board's trust. The stock is tanking because of what you did, Martin. Not because I reported it. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. I didn't create that shell company. I didn't authorize illegal payments. You did. I tried to steer you away from reckless choices and you ignored me. You ignored the board. You acted like you were above the law, and now the consequences are here. Each word landed like a hammer blow. Because they were true. Undeniably, painfully true. Martin felt the fight draining out of him. He looked around the table, at faces that had once lit up when he entered a room, at people who'd hung on his every word, and saw only judgment. Only the realization that he'd failed them, that his arrogance and his shortcuts and his absolute certainty in his own infallibility had brought them all to this moment. But he had one card left to play, one last desperate appeal. His tone changed, softened. He looked at Elena, and for a moment the boardroom fell away, and it was just the two of them. Just Martin and Elena, the way it had been on that night 3 years ago when they'd shared bourbon and secrets and kisses that tasted like possibility. Elena, he said, and his voice broke slightly. "You and I, we've been through so much. You know me. You know I always had this company's best interests at heart." The subtext was clear to her, even if it was invisible to everyone else. After all we were to each other, after what we shared, are you really going to destroy me? Elena felt something twist in her chest. A pang of grief for what might have been. For the man she'd glimpsed beneath the ego, the one who'd told her about his lonely childhood and his desperate drive to matter. That man had been real. She'd cared about him, maybe loved him. But that man had also chosen power over principle, chosen shortcuts over integrity, chosen to keep her at arm's length rather than truly see her as an equal. And in the end, that man had forced her hand. "What I want," she said softly, and there was genuine sadness in her voice now, "is a company that isn't built on lies. What I want is for Axiom to survive, even if that means without you." The words hung in the air between them. A goodbye. A verdict, a door closing on what had been and what could never be again. Martin closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was a hollowness there that hadn't existed before. The light had gone out. He looked around the boardroom one more time, at the directors who were already mentally writing him out of the story, at the stock ticker showing the destruction of his legacy in real time, at Elena standing tall and certain in a way he'd never quite managed to break. He'd lost, completely, utterly, and everyone in this room knew it. The directors huddled at the far end of the table, voices low and urgent. Martin stood by the window, staring out at Kansas City, the city where he'd built his empire, where he'd been king of his own castle. Below, people went about their Monday morning, completely unaware that 15 floors above them, a dynasty was ending. Behind him, he could hear Elena on her phone, her voice crisp and professional as she coordinated with the legal team. "Full cooperation with the SEC," she was saying. "We need to get ahead of this. Transparency is our only option now." She'd already moved on, already stepped into the role he was about to lose. She'd probably been preparing for this for months, years maybe, and he'd been so blind, so certain of his own invincibility, that he'd handed her everything she needed to take him down. Footsteps approached. Clarence Shaw, looking older than he had an hour ago. "Martin," he said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "The board has voted. Effective immediately, you are suspended as CEO pending the outcome of the investigation." Suspended, the word that meant fired, but sounded more professional. "Elena will assume the role of interim CEO to guide the company through this crisis." Of course she would. Martin wanted to laugh, to rage, to overturn the entire table and watch it all burn. But he was too tired, too hollowed out. He simply nodded. Patrice appeared at his elbow, her expression a mix of pity and something else. "I'm sorry, Martin," she said quietly. "This is the only way to stabilize things. We can't risk the company falling apart. Can't risk the company." As if the company was somehow separate from him. As if Axiom could exist without Martin Harper. Except it could, couldn't it? Elena would make sure of that. She'd steady the ship, calm the investors, restore trust. She'd probably be better at it than he'd ever been. That was the worst part. Not that she'd beaten him, but that she might actually be right. Security had arrived. 2 men in dark suits, trying to be discreet and failing. They positioned themselves near the door, waiting for the signal to escort the founder out of his own building. Martin shook them off angrily when they moved to touch his arm. "I know the way," he growled. But before he left, before he walked out of that boardroom for what might be the last time, Martin turned back. Elena stood at the head of the table, gathering papers. His presentations, his grand plans for an acquisition that would never happen now. The morning sun caught the side of her face, and she looked almost regal. A queen who'd patiently waited for the king to destroy himself. Their eyes met across the room. And in that moment, Martin saw everything clearly for the first time. Saw the woman he'd underestimated, the lover he'd dismissed, the equal he'd refused to acknowledge. Saw the careful architect of his downfall. Saw someone who'd been 3 moves ahead while he was still celebrating his last victory. Elena's expression softened slightly. A small, sad smile, not triumphant, Not cruel, just final. A goodbye to what they'd been and what they'd never be again. Martin turned and walked out. The doors closed behind him with a sound like thunder, or maybe like the ceiling of a tomb. The stock ticker, $87 and holding. The board members filed out quietly, some avoiding Martin's path, others giving those corporate nods that meant nothing and everything. In the hallway, Martin could see Axiom employees trying not to stare, trying to pretend they weren't watching the man who'd built this company being escorted out by security. How long had it taken to build Axiom? 15 years of 18-hour days, of risk and vision and sheer force of will. How long had it taken to lose it? 1 hour, one meeting, one perfectly timed detonation. Elena remained in the boardroom, alone now, standing where Martin had stood that morning when he'd felt like the master of the universe. She looked out at the Kansas City skyline, the same view, the same office, but everything had changed. Her phone buzzed. "Patrice, are you okay?" Was she okay? Elena wasn't sure. She felt exhausted, relieved, victorious, grieving, all of it at once. She'd done what needed to be done. She'd chosen principle over personal history. She'd saved the company from Martin's recklessness and corruption. But she'd also just destroyed a man she'd once cared about, a man who, for all his faults, had built something remarkable, a man who'd shown her glimpses of vulnerability and humanity beneath the armor of ego. Was that justice? Was that necessity? Or was it just what happens when two ambitious people collide and only one can survive? Elena didn't have an answer. Maybe there wasn't one. She turned away from the window, from the view of the city she and Martin had both tried to conquer in their own ways. There was work to do, press statements to craft, investors to reassure, an SEC investigation to navigate, a company to save. The boardroom battle was over, but as Elena well knew, winning the battle and winning the war were two very different things. And the war, the real war for Axiom's survival and her own legacy, was just beginning. So here's the question that should haunt you. When you finally get everything you fought for, everything you sacrificed for, everything you betrayed for, is it worth what you had to become to get it? Would you know the exact moment your life split into before and after? For Martin Harper, it was 10:47 a.m. on a Monday in Kansas City when security escorted him through the lobby of Axiom Industries for the last time as CEO. Employees pretended to focus on their screens, but he could feel their eyes tracking him like a wounded animal limping across the savannah. Some faces showed shock, others satisfaction. A few, and this hurt most, showed nothing at all, as if he'd already become irrelevant. A footnote in a story that was moving on without him. The morning sun was too bright when he stepped outside. Martin stood on the sidewalk, blinking like a man emerging from a cave, while behind him the building rose 15 stories of glass and steel that he'd filled with his vision, his ambition, his absolute certainty that he was building something immortal. Turns out, immortality has an expiration date, and his had just passed. His phone was already exploding. Texts, calls, emails cascading in faster than he could process. Lawyers, PR people, board members who 20 minutes ago had voted to suspend him. Martin silenced it all and sat down on a bench across the street from Axiom's headquarters. Not because he had a plan, but because his legs had stopped working properly, and sitting seemed like the only option that didn't involve collapsing. And he watched people enter the building he'd built, watched them leave, watched the world continue spinning as if nothing had changed, even though his entire universe had just imploded. Have you ever lost something so fundamental to your identity that you're not sure who you are without it? That's where Martin was. For 15 years he'd been Axiom, the visionary, the founder, the man who'd made billions from nothing. Strip that away, and what remained? A 52-year-old man sitting on a bench, watching his empire function perfectly fine without him. Meanwhile, 15 floors above, Elena Covington was learning what it felt like to stand in the eye of a hurricane. The board had dispersed, but the crisis was far from over. Her phone rang constantly. Investors demanding explanations, analysts trying to get quotes, journalists smelling blood in the water. And through it all, Elena maintained that same steady composure that had made the board trust her in the first place. But inside, she felt like she'd just survived a car crash. Adrenaline still coursing through her system, hands that wanted to shake but couldn't because people were watching. That strange disconnect between what you've accomplished and what you've destroyed to accomplish it. Patrice Dubois found her in Martin's old office, Elena's office now, though it still smelled like his cologne. "You did the right thing," Patrice said, and she meant it. But Elena heard the unspoken question underneath. "But did it have to be like this?" "I know," Elena replied, staring at the Kansas City skyline. The same view Martin had loved. But knowing something is right doesn't always make it feel right. Here's what the media would never understand, what the headlines screaming about corporate betrayal and whistleblower heroics would miss entirely. Elena hadn't wanted this. She'd wanted Martin to be the man she'd glimpsed in those late-night conversations, the one who cared about building something meaningful. She'd wanted him to listen when she raised concerns. She'd wanted him to choose integrity over ego. But wanting doesn't change reality. And reality was that Martin Harper had committed fraud, and Elena had been forced to choose between protecting him or protecting everyone else. The first 72 hours after Martin's ouster moved with the speed of a nightmare you can't wake up from. By Monday afternoon, every major financial news outlet had the story. By Tuesday morning, Martin's face was on the cover of the Wall Street Journal with the headline, "The Fall of a Tech Titan." By Wednesday, the SEC had issued formal subpoenas and Martin's legal team was in full crisis mode. Axiom's stock, which had cratered to $87 that Monday morning, slowly began to stabilize. Not recover, stabilize. The market was waiting to see what would happen next. Would the company survive without its founder? Would the SEC investigation uncover more corruption? Was this the beginning of the end, or just the end of the beginning? Elena answered those questions with actions, not words. She held an emergency all-to-hands meeting Tuesday afternoon, addressing every Axiom employee via video conference. Her message was clear: transparency, accountability, cooperation with investigators. No more shortcuts, no more ego-driven decisions. The company would survive this because it was built on the talent and dedication of its people, not on one man's personality. Employees who'd been terrified they'd lose their jobs started to breathe again. Investors who'd been panicking started to see a path forward. And slowly, painfully, Axiom began the process of separating Martin Harper from Axiom Industries. But could you really separate the two? That's the question that haunted the hallways and conference rooms. Martin had been there from the beginning. His vision, his deals, his relationships had built every brick of this empire. How do you extract someone so fundamental without the whole thing collapsing? Elena was determined to find out. Martin, meanwhile, was discovering what it's like to be radioactive. Friends who'd returned his calls within minutes now let them go to voicemail. Investors who'd praised his genius were suddenly unreachable. Invitations to conferences and galas, the social currency of his class, dried up overnight. He'd gone from celebrated to untouchable in 72 hours. His lawyers were blunt. The evidence Elena had provided to the SEC was damning. Shell company transactions, wire transfers, email correspondence that looked really bad when stripped of context. They could fight it, certainly, but fighting meant months of depositions, media scrutiny, and potential criminal charges. The best-case scenario was a settlement that would cost him tens of millions in fines and permanently bar him from serving as an officer of any public company. The worst case? Prison time. Martin sat in his lawyer's office, a sleek downtown suite that probably cost more per month than most people earned in a year, and listened to his options with the detachment of a man watching his own execution. How had this happened? How had he gone from untouchable to destroyed so completely, so quickly? The answer, of course, was Elena. Elena, who'd been patient. Elena, who'd been thorough. Elena, who'd waited for exactly the right moment to detonate a bomb he'd built himself 7 years ago and forgotten about. "We need to discuss your relationship with Mess Covington," his lead attorney said, and Martin's attention snapped back to the present. "The SEC will want to know about your professional history. If there's anything personal that might be relevant, there's nothing. Martin lied automatically, because what could he say? That he'd been sleeping with his CFO 3 years ago? That she'd ended it, and he'd been too proud to fight for her? That maybe, just maybe, this entire takedown was revenge for a broken heart mixed with genuine ethical concerns? Even thinking it made him feel pathetic. But was it true? That's the question Martin couldn't stop asking himself. Was Elena's whistleblowing purely about principle, or had he hurt her badly enough that she'd been looking for a way to hurt him back? And if it was both, if she'd been motivated by ethics and personal betrayal, did that make her actions more justified or less? He didn't have an answer, and the not knowing was driving him crazy. A week passed. Then, too, the media feeding frenzy began to die down as new scandals emerged to capture the public's attention. But the SEC investigation ground forward with bureaucratic inevitability, subpoenas, document requests, interviews with current and former Axiom employees. The machinery of justice moves slowly, but it moves. Elena threw herself into the work of saving Axiom. She restructured the executive team, bringing in a new chief operating officer with a reputation for ethical leadership. She initiated a comprehensive audit of every acquisition Axiom had made in the past decade, making it clear that if there were more skeletons in the closet, she wanted them found and dealt with immediately. She met with major shareholders one by one, rebuilding trust through transparency and competence. And slowly, incrementally, it worked. By the end of the first month, Axiom's stock had recovered to $105. Not where it had been, but heading in the right direction. Analysts started publishing reports with cautiously optimistic titles like Axiom Industries, a company reborn, and new leadership, new direction. Elena Covington was being hailed as the hero who'd saved the company from its corrupt founder. Magazine profiles, invitations to speak at conferences, recognition as one of the most powerful women in tech. Everything Martin had once enjoyed was now being transferred to her. Did she enjoy it? That's the complicated part, because Elena had never wanted to be famous. She'd wanted to do good work, build something sustainable, prove that you could succeed without compromising your ethics. The media attention felt less like validation and more like being on display, like everyone was watching to see if she'd make the same mistakes Martin had made. If power would corrupt her, the way it had corrupted him. Late at night, alone in her downtown loft, Elena sometimes wondered if she'd done the right thing. Not ethically, she knew exposing the fraud was correct. But tactically, could she have handled it differently? Given Martin a chance to make things right privately? Avoided the public spectacle that had hurt so many people, including employees whose stock options had been decimated. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her head. Child, you can't control how people react to the truth. You can only control whether you tell it. Elena had told the truth. The consequences, all of them, were what happened when truth collided with power. 3 months after the boardroom confrontation, Martin Harper sat on that same bench across from Axiom headquarters. He'd been coming here most days, though he couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was the same impulse that makes people return to the scene of an accident. Maybe it was because this was the only place where he still felt connected to the thing he'd lost. His legal battle was ongoing. The SEC wanted a settlement. His lawyers were negotiating. Eventually, there would be fines, penalties, a formal admission of wrongdoing. His reputation was destroyed, his legacy tarnished. Forbes had run a retrospective article titled "The Cautionary Tale of Martin Harper, When Vision Isn't Enough." But here's what was strange. Sitting on that bench, watching Axiom employees come and go, Martin felt something he hadn't felt in years: relief. The pressure of being Martin Harper, genius, visionary, untouchable CEO, had been crushing, even when he'd been winning. The need to always be right, always be bold, always be 3 steps ahead of everyone else. It had been exhausting. Now, stripped of all that, he was just a man. Flawed, humiliated, but maybe, for the first time in decades, actually honest about who he was. A young woman exited Axiom's building, probably an engineer or analyst, carrying a coffee and talking animatedly on her phone. She walked right past Martin without a glance. Why would she notice him? He was just some middle-aged guy on a bench, not the founder of her company, not anyone important. And strangely, that felt okay. Inside Axiom's 15th floor executive suite, Elena stood at the window looking down at the street below. She couldn't see Martin from this angle, but she knew he'd been there. Security had mentioned it. Some of the employees had noticed. The exiled founder, haunting the perimeter of his lost kingdom. Should she feel victorious? Vindicated? Elena mostly felt tired. The work of rebuilding Axiom was enormous. Every day brought new challenges, new crises to manage, new proof that leading a company was harder than critiquing its leadership. She understood now, in a way she hadn't before, some of the pressure Martin had been under. Not the fraud, there was no excuse for that, but the weight of having thousands of people depending on your decisions. The loneliness of leadership, the constant scrutiny. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped her understand how a smart person could make catastrophically bad choices. Patrice appeared in her doorway. The SEC just called. They've reached a settlement with Martin, 50 million in fines, permanent officer ban, 3 years probation. No prison time. Elena nodded slowly. It was about what she'd expected. Justice, in its corporate form. Martin would be punished but not destroyed. He'd lose money and status but keep his freedom. And Axiom could finally move forward without the sword of investigation hanging over it. "How do you feel?" Patrice asked. How did she feel? Elena wasn't sure. "Like we can finally close this chapter," she said. "Like maybe now we can focus on building instead of surviving. You know he still sits outside sometimes," Patrice said carefully. Martin. On that bench across the street, Elena did know, and some part of her wanted to go down there, to sit beside him, to have the conversation they'd never had. The one where he explained why he'd made those choices, where she explained why she'd had to expose them, where they acknowledged that they'd both been casualties of their own ambitions. But what would be the point? The past couldn't be changed. The damage couldn't be undone. They'd made their choices, and now they lived with the consequences. "Let him sit," Elena said quietly. "Everyone needs a place to grieve." 6 months after the fall of Martin Harper, Axiom Industries held its annual shareholder meeting. Elena stood at the podium, looking out at investors and analysts and journalists, and delivered a report that showed modest but steady growth. Stock price stabilized, revenue increasing, new products in development. A company that had survived its crisis and emerged, if not stronger, then at least intact. The shareholders applauded. Questions were asked and answered. No one mentioned Martin Harper's name, though his absence hung over the room like a ghost. This was Axiom's future now, built on transparency and ethics and the steady leadership of a woman who'd chosen principle over loyalty. After the meeting, Elena returned to her office and found an envelope on her desk. No return address, just her name written in handwriting she recognized instantly. Her heart rate picked up as she opened it. Inside was a single page, handwritten. "Elena, I won't insult you by saying I'm sorry. You did what you thought was right, and maybe you were right. I've had a lot of time to think about my choices, about who I became, about the shortcuts I took, because I thought the ends justified the means. They didn't. You were always stronger than me, more principled. I saw that, and it intimidated me, which is probably why I pulled away. I couldn't admit that you might be better at this than I was, that you might see things I was blind to. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that Axiom is in good hands, better hands than mine ever were. Build something great. Build it honestly. And maybe that will be my legacy too. That I brought you in, even if I never understood what you'd become. M. Elena read the letter 3 times, feeling emotions she couldn't quite name. Sadness for what might have been. Respect for the self-awareness it must have taken to write those words. Relief that maybe, finally, they could both move forward. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. Not to forget, but not to dwell on either. Her phone buzzed. Another crisis. Another decision that would affect thousands of lives. The work never stopped. Leadership never rested. Elena took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked back into the fray. Because that's what you do when you choose to carry the weight. You carry it every day, with integrity, with humility, and with the knowledge that someday someone might be watching you the way Elena had watched Martin, looking for the moment when you compromise your principles for convenience. And when that moment comes, what will you choose? Martin Harper never worked in corporate America again. The officer ban ensured that. But he didn't disappear either. 6 months after his settlement with the SEC, he started a small consulting firm, helping startups avoid the mistakes he'd made. Not glamorous work, not lucrative by his old standards, but honest. And slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild something that looked like a reputation. He never sat on that bench across from Axiom again. Some ghosts you have to stop feeding. Elena Covington led Axiom Industries for 3 years before stepping down to start her own investment firm, one focused on companies led by women and minorities. She'd proven what she needed to prove. Now she wanted to help others get their chance. On her last day at Axiom, she stood at that 15th floor window one more time, looking out at Kansas City, the city where 2 ambitious people had collided, where trust had been built and broken, where an empire had fallen and been rebuilt. She thought about Martin sometimes, wondered if he'd found peace, hoped he had, because carrying that much anger, that much regret, it would destroy you from the inside. Her grandmother's wisdom echoed one more time. Every choice you make plants a seed for the future. Someday, you gotta reap what you sow. Martin had reaped his harvest. So had she. And now, they both lived in the world those choices had created. Was it justice? Was it tragedy? Or was it just what happens when flawed people with too much power collide with the consequences of their actions? Maybe it was all three. The story of Martin Harper and Elena Covington isn't really about betrayal or revenge or even corporate fraud. It's about the price of ambition, the cost of compromise, the weight of choosing between loyalty and principle. It's about how we build empires on sand and then act surprised when the tide comes in. It's about the fact that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it blinds. And sometimes the person you underestimate most is the one who sees you most clearly. Martin Harper learned that lesson the hardest way possible, by losing everything he'd built to the woman he'd dismissed as controllable. Elena Covington learned a different lesson, that doing the right thing doesn't always feel right, that victory can taste like ashes, and that the crown you fought so hard to win can be heavier than you ever imagined. So here's my question for you. If you were in Elena's position, with evidence that your boss, someone you once loved, had committed fraud, what would you do? Would you protect them out of loyalty? Report them out of principle? Try to handle it quietly and risk becoming complicit? It's easy to judge from outside the situation. It's a lot harder when it's your career, your integrity, your future on the line. Drop your answer in the comments below. Would you have done what Elena did? Or would you have chosen differently? And if you would have chosen differently, are you sure that's principle talking, or is it fear? Because that's the real question this story asks. When the moment comes to choose between comfortable lies and dangerous truth, what kind of person will you be? Hit that like button if this story made you think. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the messy reality of power, ambition, and consequence. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe someone who's facing their own version of Elena's choice right now. And remember, every seed you plant today becomes the harvest you reap tomorrow. Make sure you're planting something you'll want to harvest. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, choose wisely.
Thank you so much for watching. And if you love American Stories, subscribe, like, and comment what you want me to do next.